Everybody, I hope you're all doing very well. My name's Dan, and today I want to talk to you about states, and I want to talk to you about Sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to talk to you about why these states keep experiencing coups and civil wars and internal instability, why other states, for example those in the West or in East Asia, don't, and I want to talk to you about state formation and state building more generally. And the key thing I want to emphasize here is that this is a political science video. I'm not giving you my own opinions or perspectives or hot takes. I'm taking an academic consensus found in scholarship and just relaying it to you. So what is a strong state? The key thing to understand is that the colloquial use of a strong state tends to be describing like a dictatorship or an authoritarian state or a totalitarian state. But in political science, that's not what a strong state is. What a strong state actually is just a measure of how well a state enforces its authority. So a state is classically defined as a polity which has a monopoly on legitimate force within its borders. So crime might happen within a state, but that's illegitimate, that's illegal. The only agents in a state capable of actually exerting force legally, such as a policeman or a soldier, are agents of the state itself. There's no alternate locus of power, such as a feudal aristocracy, or a church, or clans, or paramilitaries, or rebellious generals, that can legitimately exercise armed force within a state. So what a strong state, how strong a state is essentially a measure of how well that monopoly is enforced, with a strong state enforcing that monopoly on legitimate violence and a weak state failing to do so. So an authoritarian state is one which intervenes in the lives of its citizens a lot and which restricts the lives of its citizens a lot. So for example, China or Russia or North Korea. A libertarian state is the opposite. It's a state which gives its citizens more freedom and intervenes in their lives less. But the key thing to understand is how libertarian or authoritarian a state is a spectrum where all states fall, but it's completely separate from this alternate spectrum of how strong a state is. State strength and state authoritarianism are two different constructs. State strength is about saying how well can a state enforce its authority. State libertarianism versus authoritarianism is like saying, what does a state choose to do with that authority? So these are two very different things. So liberal democracies in the Western world, for example the UK, are very strong, but they're also libertarianism. So when but they're also libertarian. So when the UK passes a law, it gets obeyed. There's no alternate locus of power, such as an aristocracy or a clan or a paramilitary, which can deny the power of the central government. So taxes, military policy, all of that is controlled by the central government. Whereas if the UK had to contend with other sources of power like that, it wouldn't be a strong state, it would be a weak state. And the consequences of a weak state, the consequences of a state which cannot enforce a monopoly of legitimate force within its borders, we see in many sub-Saharan African states. So we see repeated coups, civil wars, insurrection, instability, underdevelopment, and so strong states can sometimes experience civil wars. So the UK and the USA have had civil wars, but these have been on certain specific issues, for example, slavery, or for example, the power of the monarchy. What these civil wars aren't a product of is local elites far away from the seat of central government attempting to make their own bid for power. These aren't power struggles, they're issue struggles fought by multiple strata of society. But in weak states, for example, many of those in Sub-Saharan Africa, we tend to see instead that these coups and civil wars revolve around peripheral elites breaking away from the power of the central government. So this ties into a very key point. Sub-Saharan Africa contains some of the least developed countries in the world. Why is that? Well, because as I just mentioned, this region is host to some very weak states. But why is that? What is the cause of weak or strong states? And why is it that in Western Europe we see very strong states, and in the Western world in general we see very strong states, but we see the exact opposite in Sub-Saharan Africa? So, the first really key point to emphasize here is that this is not due to any innate differences or innate qualities of Western Europeans or Sub-Saharan Africans. That is pseudoscience. Actual evidence shows repeatedly there is no inherent difference between ethnic groups. Human nature is constant, but based on the environment that human beings are in, and that can be their physical environment, their social environment, economic, political, geopolitical, structural, different aspects of human nature shine out and human beings behave differently. So the divergence in Western European and Sub-Saharan African states isn't due to any inherent qualities of the people, it's due to the conditions of these environments, Western Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. We're going to sort of compare these both to illustrate why is it that Sub-Saharan African states tend to be quite weak and therefore underdeveloped, but also we're going to be using these case studies to explore state formation and state building in general. And the environment of Sub-Saharan Africa, in contrast to that of Western Europe, so the physical environment, the structural environment, the socioeconomic environment, is designed to lead to weak and underdeveloped states. That's a property of that region. So let's get comparing. So Western European states nowadays tend to be very strong, but Western Europe has a very unique experience. So the conditions of Western Europe have led to very different kinds of state forming in Western Europe as they have in, say, China or India or Babylonia or the Middle East, these kind of great empires of the second millennium. Western European states weren't like that because the conditions that they were conceived in led them to very different kinds of states. They were structurally very different, and that put them on a different developmental trajectory. So different states, different conditions, different pathways. So some of the factors in Western Europe that led it to develop strong states apply in other regions of the world, but these factors most conspicuously do not apply to Sub-Saharan Africa, which explains why these countries are repeatedly unstable and don't have strong states. So what makes a strong state? What are the key factors that we see in Western Europe but which we don't see in Sub-Saharan Africa? There are three. One is a favorable cost-benefit ratio for establishing a strong state. Two is the nature of boundaries, and three is the international context. We're going to explore each of these in turn. So, number one, one of the reasons as to what makes a strong state is a favorable cost-benefit ratio for consolidating a state. So, states cost a lot of investment to make. A lot of resources go into consolidating a state. Because to do that, to extend authority from the seat of central government into more peripheral regions, lots of capital has to be invested. You have to build physical infrastructure, such as roads and waterways. You have to build administrative infrastructure, such as law courts, and civil servants divisions and police divisions. You have to extend personnel, you have to extend money, you have to extend raw materials, you have to extend time and energy. You also need to overcome the power of local elites, which is often done through force. Centralization is a very difficult thing to do, and it costs a lot of resources. So Western Europe has a very high population density. It's a very small region with lots of people in it. So in the Middle Ages, in Western history in general, rather I should say, not just in the Middle Ages, the scarce resource was land, not people. So different polities in the West, in Europe in general, were constantly fighting over land. So this encouraged very strictly demarcated borders of different states, with very well defended borders. Central governments were taking the resources and the money and the time to build fortifications in their borders, to send roads to their borders, to establish administrative and judicial and police presences there, or military presences there. And that cost a huge amount of capital. There was a high cost, but the cost to benefit ratio was worth it because that was a necessary advance in order to secure the states from external powers. So war in European history played this really essential element in state formation, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa has the exact opposite problem. The ratio of land to labor is skewed in the opposite direction. There's loads of land, there's not much labor. So the population density of Sub-Saharan Africa in 1975 was the same as that of Western Europe in 1500. That's a 500-year delay. So when pre-colonial African states went to war, it wasn't over territory, it was over people. So different polities raided other polities for women, slaves, and other forms of movable capital like cattle. But as a result, there's no incentive to establish strongly demarcated borders, and there's no incentive to outlay huge amounts of capital in reinforcing borders. So without the pressure to do that, the cost-benefit ratio isn't there. So the massive cost of consolidating the presence of the central government, both in physical and administrative infrastructure, that cost isn't really justified in the same way, which means that states don't get consolidated in the same way because the urgent need to do so, the urgent need for centralization, that is wars over territory, isn't there. Also, due to the low population density, the fixed cost of infrastructure might be the same, but the benefits are lower because they benefit fewer people. So for example, in a Western European polity, because population density is much higher, if you build a road to some random rural hinterland, more people benefit from that road than in a Sub-Saharan African polity where population density is really low. So the cost-benefit ratio is different. And so the political geography that predisposed pre-colonial African leaders to not consolidate strong states, that applied to all subsequent regimes and rulers. So in colonial Sub-Saharan Africa and post-colonial Sub-Saharan Africa, the exact same incentives and cost-benefit ratios still applied. So in colonial Sub-Saharan Africa, because European powers weren't going to war in Sub-Saharan Africa, there was none of that incentive to consolidate the state. The same situation applies for post-colonial Africa. So because Sub-Saharan Africa has unfortunately been the site of lots of internal conflict and violence in the 1900s, but there's been very little external warfare between different polities in Sub-Saharan Africa in that period. There are some notable exceptions, such as the Congo Wars, and when these exceptions occur, there's a massive human cost. But generally in the 1900s, there hasn't been that same pressure caused by war to consolidate the state in Sub-Saharan Africa, which means that instead, both in pre-colonial and colonial and post-colonial periods, rulers of African polities have sort of, instead of having this urgent need to centralize and consolidate the state, they've had the ability to do so at a slower pace. But because doing so has high costs, it tends not really to get done at all. So, the second reason for why states become strong, which I've kind of hinted at earlier, is the nature of boundaries. So in Western Europe, as I mentioned earlier, due to this massive competition for territory, different polities establish really strongly demarcated borders, and they reinforce them, and they spend lots of resources defending them and extending their reach to them. And that's really important because it means that authority doesn't diminish in the same way from the seat of central government. Whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, because territory was never competed over like this, borders didn't become these firm, well-defended things, which means that as you get further away from the seat of central authority in a Sub-Saharan African state, the actual authority of the state gets lower and lower and lower, and the authority of local elites gets higher and higher and higher. Because in Western Europe, in Western European polities, that was much more difficult in the second millennium, because you had this seat of central authority, and then this border region where central authority was also very predominant, and local elites got kind of squashed between them. That's not been the case for Sub-Saharan African polities, because the incentive to enforce authority in the borders just wasn't really there. And again, the same happens in colonial and post-colonial regimes. Borders weren't being fought over. So rather than being forced to bring the state's full authority to boundaries, central governments were sort of able to relax a little bit and not have to do that. But as a result, authority doesn't get applied in the same way as one gets further from the central government. And in rural areas, especially further from the central government, central authority is often very, very weak. So, the third factor, which leads to a strong state, is the international context. Because so far we've been talking about states in a sort of isolated context, but states are not isolated. They exist within a system. So in Western Europe, the international context that emerged in the process of state formation was one which really strongly emphasized the need for boundaries, and later, which strongly emphasized the idea of sovereignty, of different states being these discrete, separate, territorially demarcated units, rather than having kind of overlapping regions of authority at the end, and being sovereign within those regions, so having ultimate power within those territorially demarcated regions. And then later in the 1800s, the international context of Western Europe was one which emphasized nation states. So the idea of having these very discrete political units with high levels of centralization, consisting of a single, or rather a few closely related ethnic groups with a common identity. And this worked for Western Europe, and this was the natural form of international context for Western Europe, because again, there was a really high population density, so competition over territory was really intense. But in pre-colonial Africa, for example, polities were not nation states, and they weren't sovereign in the same way. So you had seats of central authority, but at the borders, at the sort of hinterlands, different central authorities tended to overlap. And rather than, so in Western Europe, the idea of owning a land, having legal ownership of territory, and having the immediate control of that territory are strongly linked. Whereas in pre-colonial Africa, these concepts were decoupled. So it was possible for a polity to own an area without having control over that. Similarly, in pre-colonial Africa, a political group could occupy a territory and wield authority over that territory without being considered by others to have legal ownership over that area. And that all makes complete sense in a political geography where land is really, really abundant and labor is really, really small. So in pre-colonial Africa, polities were not sovereign in the same way, and they weren't nation states. They would either be empires with authority diminishing with the distance from the center and kind of dealing with different sort of loci of power within that polity, or polities away from centers of strong influence would be independent city-states or independent decentralized villages. And this is the sort of natural form of international context, this kind of array of different form of polities that makes sense in a low population density area. But during colonialism, the Western European international context was enforced on Sub-Saharan Africa. The idea of strongly demarcated nation states, well, in fact, they weren't nation states in colonial times because wildly different ethnic groups were lumped together in the same polity. That kind of idea of strictly demarcated sovereign polities was enforced completely in disregardance of the political geography of Sub-Saharan Africa. So afterwards, after that process of colonization, the only kind of polity which African post-colonial leaders were really familiar with were the nation state. There wasn't this kind of awareness that there were multiple different kinds of polity, such as empire, city-state, decentralized village. It was just nation state. And that nation state idea works well for state consolidation in Western Europe, in that kind of political geography, but it doesn't really work well in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the previous two problems, those of cost-benefit ratios and boundaries, get amplified. And also, because African leaders during the post-colonial period explicitly chose not to change existing borders. They explicitly chose to keep them the same. And the Organization of African Unity, one of the kind of main political superstructures in Sub-Saharan Africa, explicitly opposes self-determination for minorities within African countries. It explicitly opposes the idea of borders being remade or borders becoming more fluid. The OAU sort of prescribes this strict division of Sub-Saharan Africa into these discrete, non-overlapping territorial states. But again, that doesn't really make sense considering the political geography of Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's not natural. It's not natural to the political geography of Sub-Saharan Africa. It was imposed with Western Europe. So as a result of this, in the kind of eyes of the OAU and the UN and in international relations in general, in Sub-Saharan Africa, whoever controls the capital city within that nation is said to control the whole state, right? So generally, when the OAU or the UN thinks to themselves, who's in control of that Sub-Saharan African country, they say, okay, which group controls the capital? But that kind of thinking only really makes sense in countries with strong states, where there's a really strong central authority. So for example, whoever controls Paris can indeed be said to control France. But that's not the case in Sub-Saharan Africa, when state consolidation is much more limited and there's much less centralization. So the international context is one key reason why states don't get consolidated. Because in this case, the international context, kind of this imposition of an arbitrary form of polity that isn't natural to the political geography of Sub-Saharan Africa, that's hindering state consolidation. That's unnatural. It's this imposition which doesn't make sense considering the conditions there. So that's a very slapdash tour of state formation and state consolidation, but it's a sort of general, it's a simplification, but it is a general idea of what the gist is. It's this sort of general idea of what the consensus is on how states get built and how to explain this massive divergence in stability and standard of living between Western Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. And there's other reasons why Sub-Saharan African countries are particularly underdeveloped. So what I haven't talked about are institutions. I haven't talked about so I've talked about state consolidation and the organs of the state, such as law courts, civil service, police. I haven't mentioned anything about how they actually work, because another really key determinant of how developed a country is are its institutions, and whether these institutions are designed to funnel wealth away from the masses into a narrow elite, or whether institutions are structured to benefit society as a whole. So essentially all pre-modern states were institutionally designed to funnel wealth from the masses into a small elite, and its political structures reflected that by maintaining political power in the hands of a narrow elite. So for example, a feudal aristocracy or a merchant plutocracy, or in the case of the great classical empires, this small senatorial elite. Now in Europe, in the long 19th century, so from this period from 1789 to 1914, the institutions of these countries massively change, and they change in a way that facilitates the development of these countries by shifting political and economic power from a monopoly of a small elite into a sort of more widely accessible situation for the inhabitants of that country as a whole. And that's very good for development. But in pre-colonial Africa, institutions were designed to develop a narrow elite, as they were for all pre-modern states. But during colonialism, these exclusive sort of monopolistic institutions were maintained in African countries, and after independence, these didn't change. Which is why after independence, often what happened in Sub-Saharan African countries was that the overlords, the elite of a country, this sort of authoritarian elite, just switched from colonial overlords to native African elites, because the structures of those societies were still designed to benefit a narrow elite. I know that that's in not a huge amount of detail, and that's all a little bit abstract. I'm going to talk about that more in another polymath episode. The purpose of this episode is to specifically talk about state formation and state consolidation. We're going to be talking about development in later episodes, and we're going to be getting into that in more detail later down the line. In any case, that's it for this episode. I just wanted to mention that, just to give an idea that it's not all about state strength, it's also about institutions. And I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. I really enjoyed making it. So have a lovely day. Thank you for listening, and take care.